So what if we have two armies of similar power in Warhammer 40k, but the objectives that one of them has to achieve in game are far easier than their opponents? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I just wanted to do a short video on faction-specific secondaries and how they might be one of the things that are now limiting 40k's game balance. The other day I made a video as to which armies were doing better or worse in 40k, and certainly one of the contributing factors that seemed to be putting the top armies where they were the new and supposedly rebalanced faction secondaries in the Warzone Nephilim mission pack. As I'm sure that lots of you watching this will be aware, 9th edition Warhammer 40k has two different ways that you can score points, up to 45 points on the primary objective, holding objectives in your command phase, and also some interesting things depending on the individual mission. The other 45 points are scored up to 15 max on 3 different secondary objectives that you pick yourselves pre-game, and as you score half your points on those secondary objectives, getting big advantages in them can be a very big deal indeed. Picking which secondary objectives that you go for is a bit of a mini-game at the start before the game, and the decisions that you make really could alter how a game turns out. Generally speaking, if you can be reliably scoring 10 or more points on multiple different secondaries, then I think that you're usually going to be putting yourself at a fairly reasonable chance of winning the game, and obviously if you can aim for more, then so much the better. I think that secondaries in general do have some good and bad points in the game. On the positive side, I think they do generally make for better missions overall. It's not just simply kill this and stand there. Your units will have different competing priorities, and there might be a bunch of different routes to victory, depending on whether you're trying to achieve your own objectives or foil your opponent's ones. In theory, they can give a good player far more control as to how a game turns out. Plus, I do kind of like the way that they feel lore appropriate for certain armies to be trying to do some things. It feels very appropriate for Black Templars to be abhorring the Witch, trying to kill as many Psykers as they can. Death Guard spreading the gifts of Nurgle far and wide by corrupting objectives with their diseases, and say Adeptus Mechanicus going to find hidden technology supposedly hiding on those midfield objectives. In general, I do feel that they improve the quality of missions from an in-game point of view, though I must admit they do add a fair bit of mental load, and a lot of people really aren't big fans. At the start of the game you can have a fair bit of decision paralysis, maybe have a couple of optimal picks, but then you're stuck with trying to find the least worst out of a whole bunch of really bad objectives. Throughout the game it can make scoring a bit fiddly. You need some fairly in-depth score sheets for full-on competitive games of 40k at the moment. It certainly adds to the mental load that you need to be doing throughout the game, trying to achieve the objectives in the right phases or while coordinating all your army's abilities. And just in general it feels like secondary objectives were aimed a lot more at the competitive scene as opposed to the more casual player. I guess on the plus side they are optional. You can always play Tempest of War or a different game mode if you don't want to go with the secondary objectives. But even on the more high-end competitive scene they can cause issues as well, as they're a potential source for game imbalance, both with the generic secondary objectives and with the faction-specific ones. So I guess that brings us on to today's subject, mainly that faction secondary objectives in Nephilim really seem to have rewritten a lot of the power of different armies, at least to win tournament games. I will start by saying that I do broadly very much like the changes they did to the generic secondary objectives. They removed a few that were basically redundant and you'd almost never want to take, got rid of a couple of auto-take ones, and took out the to the last one that required you to basically just hide your units all game and didn't require much interaction. Generally I do like the changes, but with fewer choices overall it does mean that there's now more pressure on the faction secondaries to be quite good, particularly as you can take multiple faction secondaries in Nephilim. It means the power of having good faction secondaries is a lot more important than it was before, and as I was expecting with faction objectives when they first came out in 9th edition, I did think that they could be a very easy way to unbalance the game. I think that faction secondaries might well be one of the easiest areas for imbalance if Games Workshop gets them slightly wrong. You might have some datasheets that are undercosted, or some rules that work a bit more powerful than you intended to, but even then that'll usually only lead to a few more kills or something. If they have the faction secondaries even slightly out of line, that's going to directly give you more victory points at the end of a game than you might have had otherwise. And say if you've got two different factions and one of them has vastly easier secondaries, that could maybe average a player an extra 5 victory points they might expect over the course of a game, easily turning a close win or a draw into a loss. I guess good secondaries alone might not be the biggest issue if the faction as a whole isn't all that strong, but if they do manage to make armies relatively well balanced in terms of killing power, manoeuvrability and durability, then having good secondaries could genuinely be what decides a lot of matchups. I do admit I'm not really trying to be overcritical of Games Workshop here. It's very easy to pick holes in game balance after a lot of people have had lots of experience to play the game. And arguably, I think you could say that if secondary objectives are being what's determining game balance, then it means they've got a lot of other stuff right, so I guess you could say it's maybe a good problem to have rather than a bad one. Prior to all those balance updates that they did, we had armies like Tyranids and Harlequins just absolutely running rampant. It didn't really matter if you could score a few extra points on secondary objectives, when they could just be tabling your army or just destroying you on primary objectives anyway, just with their sheer raw power and utility. At the same time though, even if it only becomes visible once Games Workshop actually gets the armies somewhat balanced, it still does feel just a little bit sad if you did have two armies of relatively similar power, and one of them just happened to win a lot of matchups between the two, just because the objectives they needed to achieve are a lot easier. They score more points through the game, and maybe that even forces the other player to really have to go out and be extra aggressive, otherwise they don't have a chance of winning. I'd say the secondary objectives just feel a lot more arbitrary than a lot of the unit rules. If one faction just has a very easy mission on the go because they've got 3 great secondaries to choose from, and then the other player's left with trying to scrabble around for some suboptimal picks. Just for some examples of this, I thought we'd take a look at a couple of the good armies with secondary objectives and then one of the weaker ones. First up we have the Necron secondary objectives, and at least in a bunch of the missions and matches, these can be really easily achieved. Ancient Machineries is a Shadow Ops one, so you have to do actions on objectives for it. You can do it with core Canoptek units, which is just about everything given the recent changes. Do actions on No Man's Land's objectives that you control. The action completes at the end of your turn if your objective secured, and you score 4 victory points for doing that action. If you're playing that dynasty that has objective secured on everything, then it means that you could have cheap scarabs basically do this on 3 different objectives turn 1, and basically get 12 points out of a secondary objective before your opponents even had a chance to make a move, so they're starting the game really on the back foot. Then Purge the Vermin isn't particularly hard either. 1 victory point at the end of the turn with each table quarter with no enemy units wholly within it, and a further victory point if no enemies are in your deployment zone. Not something that you want to take against enemies with lots of multiple small units, but if you've got slow moving enemies that don't have many redeployment tricks, they might really struggle to get units in your home quarter and your deployment zone, particularly if you make efforts to screen them out or try and clear quarters just with mass firepower. Code of Combat's also pretty achievable, getting noble units to kill enemies, 3 victory points per units destroyed at range, 4 in melee, and plus 1 victory points if you kill a character. With the Silent King being absolutely awesome at the moment, this one's very easy to get some decent points with, particularly if he has something like a supporting Catacomb Command Barge swooping around. And finally we have Treasures of Eons as well. The opponent has to select 3 different objectives in No Man's Land, and you score points for controlling them at the end of your turn. 2 victory points for 1, 3 for 2, and 5 for 3. It'd be a particularly strong choice on any missions where there's only 3 objectives in No Man's Land, and basically unless you're losing super hard anyway, I think you'd be hard pressed to score less than 10 points off that. In general, if you are just playing Necrons and you can manage to keep on taking 1 or 2 central objectives each turn, plus keep enemy units out of your deployment zone or home board quarter, you're almost guaranteed to be getting 30 plus points, and I have seen quite a few Necron lists scoring a flat 100 from time to time, which does seem pretty crazy. I'd say perhaps the same is true to a slightly lesser extent for the Sisters as well. Perhaps the single most outstanding one is Defend the Shrine, the Battlefield Supremacy one, where you select any one marker not in your deployment zone, and it's 3 victory points if you control it at the end of your turn, and -3 if the enemy takes it at the game's end. This one's ridiculously easy, and should usually be a guaranteed 12 or 15. You just pick the single marker that's the easiest outside your deployment zone, throw a fair few of your units towards it, and even if your opponent takes it, you can just theoretically have your own units be jumping out of cover, charging down those enemy threats and killing them, and then retain control of the objective by the end of your turn. Their others certainly aren't bad though. Leap of Faith is just doing acts of faith in slightly weird ways. That one has very little counterplay unless the opponent tables the Sisters player. It's not too hard to make that 10 or more victory points, and it could easily be 12. And Sacred Grounds is a Shadow Ops one where you do actions on midfield objectives. These ones do have to survive the enemy counter-attack, so it's a little bit harder. But if you happen to be playing on a board where you've got a couple of objectives that are hidden in the midfield, and you can put a tanky unit on them, that potentially could be a turn 1 11 victory point swing, and if you manage to get one done towards the end of the game, then you get to max it. Again, it's pretty much 1 auto-take objective, and then 2 ones that are at least relatively doable. If we compare that, say, to a faction that has some harder objectives, say the Adeptus Mechanicus, and all of these are basically just hard. Accretion of Knowledge is killing enemy units with warlord traits, relics, or 14 or more wounds. A lot of lists might only have, say, 4 or 5 of those in an army, and even then gambling on killing all of them is a bit of a risk. Eradication of flesh means that you need to go quite vehicle heavy, and also your vehicle units need to kill more enemy units than they lose themselves. I guess it might not be entirely undoable if you take some really massive Iron Strider blocks these days, but it does feel like you have to build your army in quite a specific way. Uncharted sequencing might be one of the better ones. You need to assign each battlefield round to a different objective, and you score 3 victory points if you control it on that round, though you have to do so at the end of the battle round, so your opponent does have the opportunity to kill you off it if they happen to go second. Unlike the Sisters or Necrons ones, it pretty much guarantees that you're going to have to venture into some of the hardest objectives that the enemy has to offer, and then has the risk that if you wind up going first, the enemy is just going to be able to take down the important units that you throw on those objectives, and basically counter the secondary both by killing units and by taking 3 victory points off you each turn. Finally, this is all capped off with the Hidden Archaeovault one. This one again is Battlefield Supremacy, and this one basically feels like the Sisters Defend the Shrine one, but so much worse, because you don't get to choose the objective marker, your opponent does, and they'll pick the one that they're most likely to be trying to control all game long. Plus again, the scoring happens at the end of the battle round, not the end of the turn. So again, if the Admech player winds up going first, then they're actually at a disadvantage for this one, as they'd put units onto this objective, and then the opponent would be free to try and remove as many of them as possible, or just put objective secured units onto it to take it themselves. I must admit, outside very niche circumstances, none of these are particularly inspiring. In terms of ease to do, I'd rank all of these behind literally every one of the Necron secondaries, and also most likely behind 3 of the 4 Sisters ones in terms of ease to do. At least for these given factions, I think that their secondary objectives are actually a pretty important reason why the factions are doing well or not. Necrons and Sisters are having a pretty good time of it at the moment, and Mech are still having a lot of trouble. Army strength aside, it just really doesn't make it all that easy when some factions just are going to score a lot more victory points just for doing what they wanted to do anyway, and some factions really have to work very, very hard and take a lot more risks to get the exact same thing. So let me know what you think down in the comments below then. How important do you think these new Nephilim secondaries are to the game of 40k at the moment? And what changes might be a good idea when they do get round to updating them for the next mission pack? I must admit it does feel just a little bit frustrating after they've done a largely very good balance update, and then to see some obvious issues that could be fixed quite easily, but I do suspect they might not do so for quite a while, as they've already just overloaded us with lots of changes to the game in recent history, so they're likely to give us a fair bit of time to cool off before the next set. So let me know your thoughts, and if you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k discussions coming quite often. I do tend to post new videos just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find that down in the video description if you're interested. The channel's Patreon backers are the ones that allow me to keep on making videos like this quite so regularly, so if you are enjoying a lot, any help is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, including seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.